I've now got the great pleasure to introduce our next section, which has a lot to do with writing, and to introduce also our next speaker, Marina Warner. Many artists and writers have dealt with the topic of memory in their research. It's often been said, whilst we were actually preparing this marathon, that in neuroscience, Proust and Bergson are quoted, so philosophers and writers are quoted. Yet at the same time, we have many texts from artists about memory. I read the text of Gita Bratescu initially, so through their work, artists and writers create new archives and new ways of thinking ourselves. And several of the now following presentation have this common thread actually, an exploration of archiving, storing and deleting, and this bridge between art and writing and memory. I've now got the great pleasure to introduce Marina Warner, and maybe just one practical announcement. As it's so wonderful that so many people are here, it would be great in order to make more seats available that I could please ask you to move along the rows and not leave any empty seats so that more people can come in. That would be wonderful. Marina Warner specializes in mythology and fairy tales with an emphasis on the part women play in them. The many books she has written include Phantasmagoria, Spirit Visions, Metaphors, and Media, Stranger Magic, Charmed States, and the Arabian Nights. Her fiction includes The Lost Father, the Leto Bundle, and at the moment there is actually a forthcoming new collection of her essays on art and artists, The Symbol Gives Rise of Thought. Marina is also working on a memoir novel set in Cairo in the 1950s. She is deeply interested in libraries and archive and presents her research around the many voices and memories that storytelling and literature can give us. In her talk, Voices from the Library, Sharahzad and the 1001 Nights. A very warm welcome to Marina Warner.
Hello. The Arabian Nights are told in the night by a woman in bed with her husband. Her inspiration must not stop flowing, or she will die. She must continue summoning up stories, or she and others will wake up to reality. It is as if the dreamer must continue to dream on our behalf. Our survival depends on the continued processes of her memory. Because we are told that Sharahzad does not make up the stories. we're told clearly from the start that she's clever and learned and has never forgotten anything she has ever read. She had applied herself happily to philosophy, to medicine, to history and the fine arts, and she wrote better poetry than the most famous poets of her time. I'm quoting from the beginning. She has a library of 1,000 books, and she knows all the stories that she's telling from having read them. But does she know them verbatim? The stories unfold spontaneously, it seems, spoken aloud, directly engaging her audience in the intimate setting of the Sultan's bed. And many illustrators made great hay with these are all the stories, sorry, that's the cover of the 1829 edition. And this is one of the scenes. I'm afraid the light with the sun is not very good. But they're very often very salacious and Orientalist fantasies of this bedroom narration scene. And this was then later much toned down for children. And the bed scene actually was removed and her clothes put back on. At the end of the book of the Arabian Nights, according to some versions, Sharahzad's library is brought from her father, the vizier's house, to the palace. So the stories had already been collected. The Arabian Nights that we have been hearing are already in existence. They've been interpreted by her. Aladdin, which was probably interpolated into the Nights by the translator Antoine Galland in the beginning of the 18th century, is actually preserved through as if it had come down immemorially, and as if it had always been there, as if it is a story that is remembered and not invented. That's the genie from the first illustration of the first edition's illustration. Rather unfamiliar genie from our point of view now. Now and then in the course of the book, we're shown the circumstances in which this new version of the stories is recorded. When, for example, Harun al-Rashid, after hearing some stories told in the house of Zobeide, orders the scribes in the palace to write them down in letters of gold and place them in the palace library. This command adds to the dizzy circularity of the Nights. This copy will be a copy of something which already exists in the library that Sharahzad collected as a young, unmarried woman, except for the frame story of the Sultan Shahryar himself and her story with him. That is the only one that she has not already committed to memory. The prior existence of this vast body of stories adds to the dreamlike quality of the whole. Not exactly a collective unconscious, her library seems to stretch in infinite recession, an archive of all the stories. The 1001 in the book's title hints at infinity, as well as at multiple versions and translations. The utopian fantasy of the book includes the possibility that someone could act as the keeper of memories on this vast and labyrinthine scale, that someone like Sharahzad could fulfill the role described by the poet Derek Walcott. Every collection of human beings gathered for a long time in one place codifies itself, arranges rules of conduct, makes a calendar for its celebrations of harvest, of the shapes of the moon, with tribal melodies, and preserves its fables and its history in the archives of the shaman and the griot and the bard's memory. Poetry and imagination as record keepers, alongside the writing of history. This is a hope of survival, too. Keeping memories in the present is a wager against lost time, a stand against entropy, and a sighting of a small light in the general darkness. This is a genie from another version of Aladdin much later, the Richard Burton edition, just to show you the continuity of these stories constantly changing, so memory retains them but keeps shapeshifting them. Before the printing press and mass literacy, texts existed as blueprints for performances, recitals, speeches, songs, and other forms of oral communication. Before paper, before digitization, committing something to writing was far less practical than committing it to memory. But again, the record was fluid, and the works recreated every time they were uttered. The Homer we have is one Homer. The Iliad is a fragment of a far vaster myth. Voicing was an art of living creators who took a text and worked with it as singers or players work with a score, or perhaps even more closely as jazz soloists take up a tune and improvise it in their group. And Eric Hobsbawm's great love of jazz arose from this idea of the community of the band, the mutual exchange in which one voice emerges and then retreats and another comes in. And he saw in that something egalitarian as well as individual. The voice of the storyteller was polyphonous, and the stories created were all different and the same at one and the same time. Inscription writing was used for tallies, accounts, the law, contracts, edicts, and other reckonings intended to be solid and permanent. The logos, the word as writ meaning law. But narration belonged to a different order of time. Flowing time, mutability, chromatic harmony, metamorphoses. Every listener became and becomes a potential new storyteller. Early literature was not composed of fixed texts, but of play scripts and prompt books, storyteller scrolls, pattern books. The vocal text is mythos, the story in motion. The classical scholar Florence Dupont has argued fascinatingly in a study called The Invention of Literature that we need to switch from a utilitarian concept of writing to a symbolic one. Writing was a language that was different from speech. And anyone who has tried, like the Grimm brothers, to set down stories as they are told aloud knows how much they lose in the passage to the page and how the act of writing must translate them. And this is true of the Arabian Nights as well. Manuscripts exist, the earliest is 14th century, but the stories inside them keep changing as the tellers remember the stories from the manuscripts and then recast them. Literature was a speech act performed by living voices, present to their audiences, as in many events today, as here. Writing, according to Dupont's reading, presented an attempt to capture those voices. Literature was a kind of early phonograph, which kept the dead alive and brought them back into time present. Heroes and heroines traveled down to the underworlds of the dead, in Gilgamesh, in Homer, and in the Arabian Nights, to talk to those who have died. When they come back, they bring back news of them. Every story is an act of memory that communicates the living presence of its subjects so that they will not sink under the waters of oblivion. They keep their memory as storia, the double of history in several languages. Only 22 manuscripts containing stories from the Nights have survived, but the numbers of translations and editions and recensions wouldn't be possible to count. One manuscript collection now in the Arcadian Library here in London gives a powerful sense of the way stories lived in the world where they were made. 30 octavo notebooks, very like moleskin today, very much like that, written in a variety of hands in the 17th century with a sprinkling of red letter headings. The boards have been softened by handling, the pages tattered and torn, in some places patched and edged to stop them falling to pieces. These copies have been handled to bits. As with paper money after long use, a fusty, creaturely smell of human hands and breath rises from these working copies. They have every look of a professional storyteller's precious resources. On the inside cover, at the back of several volumes, sums and a kind of tally appear to have been kept. The number of listeners in the room, receipts for telling the story. These manuscripts belong to written literature, but their making precedes print and multiple copies and silent reading, and their form, as well as their transmission, took shape in relation to listeners, not silent readers. The exchanges between oral to written and back again is much more complex than a simple contrast between literature and orature, or between literacy and illiteracy. How did someone like Sharahzad remember the stories? How did the bards and performers remember the thousands of lines, as, for example, from the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, which Lönnrot wrote down as late as 1831 to 1849? Walter Benjamin gives us an insight into this when he emphasizes in the famous essay, The Storyteller, the connections between manual, daily, humdrum work and telling stories. Repetitive tasks produce a rhythm. They occupy a space, and both processes act as mnemonics for performance. In relation to the Nights, I want to single out one art that governs the structure and character of the stories in the book: tapestry or carpet weaving, which is the preeminent skill and trade and ordinary possession of the men and women who fill the book, used as hangings, as curtains, as picnic rugs, as prayer mats, as portable dwellings, as tents and bedchambers. The analogies with storytelling are plain, especially with regard to the Arabian Nights. Fantasy in action finds in the flying carpet of the stories a powerful and delightful symbol. The unfurled carpet, which rises above the action and spreads out level and moves over it, embodies the features that distinguish traditional unauthored narratives, originating in oral culture. The repetition of motifs, their imbrication in bands and borders, also reproduces graphically the layering of the narrative method and the repetitions and condensation of motifs in an anthology like The Nights. To understand the thinking that turned the folk motif of a flying carpet into such a prime symbol of fantasy today, it's necessary to press a little farther, deeper into the analogies between carpets, desire, memory, and narrative, specifically the narrative of dream thoughts and fantastic storytelling. Remembering the stories reflects relations between text and textile and provides remarkable instances of the mind at work, ordering and patterning, combining and permutating. They reveal the logic of imagination at work at a profound unconscious level, and the carpet of the Nights metonymically enacts the work of imagination in making up a story and perusing it, knotting a plot or following it from a repertory. Forming a plot or following it from a repertory of elements in different recurring combinations adds to the satisfaction of the audience. The perceived figure in the carpet brings the pleasure of recognition, while the metonymies of rug, carpet, and fabric condensed many desired properties of fantasy narrative: satisfying pattern, containing frame, harmonic relations of detail and whole, significant ornament, pleasurable texture, atmospheric color. These practical functions flower into figurative meanings, which have expanded further as material conditions themselves have changed. Persian or Oriental carpets only rarely tell stories as such, or contain human figures. On the whole, the surface is webbed and interlaced with abstract geometric ornamental elements and designs. The symbols used are ancient, familiar, and conventional: the arabesques, circles and stars, palmettes and rosettes, the medallions and the paisley commas, the key or other border motifs, the creatures, angels, dragons, grotesques, birds, and other animals sprinkled here and there are all recognizable. But the key to their relations is not given. This is enigma, and it draws you in. The intricacy and system of a woven carpet imply a strong degree of predictability. The symmetry and recursive repetitions work analogously to oracles and predictions. The patterns must come out in a certain sequence, so remembering them becomes paramount in the act of weaving. Many of the stories in the Nights establish such a pattern and follow it to its outcome. Often that outcome is predicted by an oracle or a spell, or it can be anticipated by the reader from the character of the story we're in. Much pleasure for the reader arises when, like the protagonist or another character in the story takes an unexpected turn and springs a different denouement, or when, in some cases, the reader succeeds in foreseeing the end result of the character's actions because they remember the beginning when the characters themselves do not. In these ways, the story ties up its subjects and its audience, both of us, in crafty knots and self-mirroring devices. Reading is an act of memory. The man who recognizes his own house in another man's dream about a fortune hidden in a courtyard under the floor. The fate of the three robbers who indeed do meet death under a tree as foretold, because they fight there over the treasure and kill one another. These are stories that double back on themselves in symmetrical order, riddles that come out according to preordained rules. Nabokov catches the character of time, this recursive character of time in the Arabian Nights, when he brings in the image in his memoir, Speak, Memory. He writes, "I like to fold my magic carpet after use in such a way as to superimpose one part of the pattern upon another. A Turkish rug or oriental carpet from Egypt, Iraq, the Eastern Mediterranean, the heartlands of the Arabian Nights, above all consists of a formal, abstracted pattern created by repeating and mirroring rhythms into which a repertory of certain figurative elements have been woven. Italo Calvino, who undertook his anthology, Italian Folktales, to create a comparable body of stories to the Grimm brothers' German collection, emphasized the correspondences with the weaving process, in which patterns keep shifting and producing new patterns, each time producing a new story. Writing about Giambattista Basile, the 17th century Neapolitan author of the Pentamerone, Calvino underlies the way ornament belongs in the essential structure of narrative, and proposes a reading, this is Calvino, in which metaphors, rather than being considered an ornament that adorns the fundamental interweaving of plot, subplots, and narrative functions, then move forward into the foreground as the true substance of the text, bordered by the decorative arabesque threadwork of fabulous vicissitudes. As Freud said of his own dream analysis, the weaver conjugates structural motifs in infinite combinations within a basic structure of frame, ground, and figure, and then inflects each one differently through variations of color, dimensions, and quality of materials. So the actual structure of the carpet resembles the plot structure of the stories, and it's because you remember where you are in the architecture and structure that you then know how to embroider the next bit. And there's also the question of the borders, of putting one thing inside another, which I think picks up what Ian was saying about placing things in a room. The storyteller remembers how to go from one place to another because they are placed within a nested system, as in a carpet, as the weaver remembers where to go on the warp. The most significant coming together of storytelling, memory, and recursive patterning, and an oriental carpet took place when Sigmund Freud draped the Smyrna rug, which he had been given as an engagement present, over the modern couch in his consulting rooms, and turned a stark modern chaise longue, as you see here, into a dream space for drawing up memories from the deep wells of the unconscious, and to enable the memory work of the individual to take place, the fundamental process in contemporary literature of the 20th century, as Hans-Ulrich mentioned, and of course into this. So finally, my last point. At certain points in the cycle, someone inside the stories of the Nights is about to tell a marvelous tale, and they will say, if you inscribed this tale with a needle in the corner of the eye, it would give matter for reflection to those who can understand its lesson. This strange and extended metaphor raises shivers as it searches out an area of extreme sensitivity, but it also works with the symbolism of the eye as the organ of discernment and a vehicle of power. The story is earning its place among sacred apotropaic texts and the ranks of amulets and talismans, like an Egyptian widget eye, or the Eye of Fatima. Sorry, I'll just go forward a little bit. Or the Eye of Fatima inscribed with sacred formulae on the palm of her protective hand. It can protect against the evil eye. I don't know if you can see the hands are raised. There's an eye in the center of the hand, and they're inscribed with formulae, which, as in these talismanic clothes, this is a talismanic robe from Turkey. The whole of the robe is covered in writing that is not intended to be read, but is enshrining the magic power of those words when they're spoken. So these are blessings and defense apotropaic charms to prevent danger happening to the wearer. These are very precious garments made by the elite, but they reflect a practice throughout Islam. And that's a detail of it. So the ultimate accolade for a story or stories is to be written down, if not in the corner of the eye, as in that figure of speech, then in a book to be placed in a library. The act of memorialization consecrates the story and fixes its power. It turns mythos into logos. Perhaps it contains those dead whom the narrator has visited, has conjured up, and keeps them quiet. At different moments of pause in the course of the 1001 Nights, a figure of power, like Harun al-Rashid, will order that the remarkable adventures be set down and put in the palace library, as we heard. Sharahzad's tale are making the passage from verbal to written, from live to enshrined memory, when the Sultan makes this decree that they should last forever, that they should never be forgotten, and to be inscribed in letters of gold, like a magic gem or talisman, which becomes live and powerful, charged by the words inscribed onto its constitutive inert matter. This is the transformation of moving memory by inscription into monument, into memorial. Acts of memory, protests against forgetting, are acts to keep off danger. Defining those dangers falls to the storyteller and to the historian.